when we're thinking about us being responsible for our own feelings or our emotions is when someone breaks or doesn't fulfill an expectation. Where is that line between us taking accountability for management of our own emotions and sincerely talking about how someone affected us, how someone's actions affected us? Hello, everyone.
Hello, welcome back.
Welcome. My name is Keely Helmick. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a white, queer sex therapist, also co-owner of Connected Therapy Collective, and able-bodied. Melissa, you want to quickly introduce yourself again?
Absolutely. My name is Melisa. I am a licensed therapist with Connective Therapy Collective. I am a cis, white, bisexual, female, polyamorous, able-bodied as well. And again, there may be some specifiers I am missing, but there are a lot of things that I am.
Yeah, I forget. Yeah, and I didn't say I'm fluid relationship-wise. I have been polyamorous in the past, non-monogamous, currently in a monogamous dating situation. The status of our relationship keeps changing, which is a great intro to our topic for today about expectations. Okay. So expectations. I mean, what are expectations anyway? Like what we think someone else should be doing? What do expectations mean in relationships? And I don't think this is not a queer specific. We always are talking from a place of queer relationships. And I mean, this comes up in all types of relationships, including non-romantic relationships. I think it's just more evident in our romantic relationships. So the reason, Melissa, I brought this up, you and I were talking, of course, because we always chat beforehand. For those that don't know, we tend to do chat. I think that's normal. Like people chat. If you're going to talk on a episode or a podcast or something, you like talk before.
Yeah, you huddle up and then you go into the motion.
And sometimes you wish you could have just recorded what you're talking about beforehand because it sounded really good. And then you start recording and it doesn't quite sound as good as it did. Yeah.
But that's us managing our expectations for the finished product of the podcast.
Yes, managing expectations. Yeah, is that what I do as a therapist? Is that what I'm supposed to do as a couples therapist? Manage everyone's expectations? Manage expectations with myself. That's it. So, scenario. I'm going to set up the scenario. The reason why I even want to talk about this topic is clients coming in and saying, this was a monogamous queer couple who came in and said, my partner said that they would do this and they didn't, and they're not meeting my expectations. What should I do if somebody doesn't meet my expectations? That was it. That was the main point. It's like a couple talking to me as a therapist being like, well, my partner didn't meet my expectations. So what am I supposed to do? And I'm like, so you're looking for an answer to that. And part of me is like, well, is that your job? Or are you their parent? Like I didn't know how to answer it. And so I've really been mulling this over of these predetermined ideas that we have of what does an expectation mean in a romantic relationship?
Yeah. And where is the place for expectations? And you had brought this up, Keely, as we were chatting, but maybe there's a reframe needed or a different word to use. Because when I hear expectations, I can't help but go to sort of a cognitive behavioral mindset of it sounds like a should statement in hiding. Like you should, I have the expectation that my partner should do X, Y, and Z every time this happens, and number one, those expectations come from us. I'm certainly guilty of having lots of expectations in relationships, which I think is, once again, if you've listened to any of the other episodes, part of the theme of why I am in very different kinds of relationships right now. And yeah, which ones do you get to talk to? What are the agreements you can come to with a partner rather than having this set of rules that either one has to follow? And then for what? To feel loved, to feel validated? What are they for? What's the purpose of expectations? Is it about one's personal safety? Those are the kinds of questions that I like to get into in sessions with folks.
So part of what you're saying is taking apart or deconstructing what what an expectation even is. And I think the piece that you touched on and what I find, I mean, I've been thinking about this for weeks. I'm like, oh, this is coming up again and again and again. More than even sex is coming up in these couples sessions right now, is these expectations. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. These are things based on this idea that there was no mutual agreement. So it's like, oh, I have this expectation of you, but I never really told you. So, oh, by the way, you're supposed to read my mind. Forgot to mention that too. When you first started dating, and it's almost like this post-consent agreement. Like we have the sex, we have the sex consensual talks. But then when we have these relationship or when we talk about outside of the sexual pieces, these expectations, or even, I mean, sexually two expectations,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not mutually agreed upon.
Right. We can fall into this trap of assuming that everyone else knows exactly how we want to be treated at all times. And that's just not the case. I mean, half the time I feel like the work is knowing individually how we want to be treated so we can communicate that, which that's where the work is for some folks, myself included in that category. And when you're talking about agreements too, I think part of that has to be the conversation about what happens when these agreements aren't met. Similar to in couples therapy, I'm often talking to people in the first couple sessions, normalizing conflict. Yeah. Okay, conflict's going to come up. So what are we going to agree to do when that happens? So that we're front loading it, and similar with expectations, even if there's agreements that are made, we're human, right? Things come up. We are not perfect. And we have our own set of trauma responses that often dictates behavior before we have a chance to think about it or understand what's happening. So what's the agreement about when these quote unquote expectations are not met?
Yeah. So that's the piece of, oh, well, what I do, this person didn't do this thing. They did not meet my expectation. What should I do? That was the question I was asked as a therapist. Yeah. And it was like, well, how do we talk about our own boundaries and what we're asking for? But if we expect someone to be a certain way without asking or without a request, then how do they know that's what we want or that's our desire? And then there's this like, oh, well, it's just the social norm. It's like, okay, but social norms are dictated by white cis-hetero-monogamy. Right. And so then that's what really shifts and confuses. Oh, you should just know. It's like, well, no, what? Because if someone has a vulva, that means that they're a woman, which means that they want flowers on the first date. Like, or opening the door or paying. I mean, we could deconstruct that, paying for who pays for the meals, how often. I mean, I definitely fall into that category sometimes. I remember not knowing I had a person I was dating and they were newly out. She was newly out and she always paid for me. And it was one of my first full long-term relationships with a woman in my adulthood. And she just paid. And I was like, oh, that's really nice. And then at some point, I think it was 6 or 8 months into the relationship, it was like, she almost always pays for me. And then she tells me later that she was resentful of that. And I was like, oh, what? She's like, well, I thought I was just supposed to pay. I'm like, why are you the one that's supposed to pay? And it was like, because she's the more mask identified. It was like, whoa, this social norm. And she was also from Texas. So she had all these interesting social norms, me being from Oregon, very different. But there are these ingrained things. And that to me was very cis-heteronormative because she's like more mask looking or mask presenting. And so she just always thought she had to do it. And then she built, and that's the other piece that we didn't bring up is the buildup of resentment too. Yeah. Not meeting unspoken expectations.
Right. Absolutely. And the resentment can really, that can be so toxic. I think anyone who has had experience that can really break a relationship. And, as you were talking about that, it makes me think of expectations almost as assumptions.
Yes.
There are these unspoken agreements that we've never actually talked about, but it's an assumption, yeah. And that can happen with behavior. It can get I know I've fallen into this camp in relationships. If I do that, you're going to do this for me, and I'm not going to have to request it or say that's why I'm doing this thing. It's just going to be this unspoken reciprocal thing so that I feel good. But again, this is all from my perspective and only in my awareness, unless I actually communicate this to a partner.
And so where does it even come up to even start? I mean, I think that's where there's so many advantages to that's the poly dynamic, because I find when I'm in poly dynamics or non-monogamy and with the couples that I work with, folks that I work with who are practicing non-monogamy, is that there is more agreement set up, just like BDSM kink. Like with consent, there's the norm, the cis-hetero-monogamous norm is to not talk about the things, to have more assumptions and less agreements. And outwardly, there's, for well done consensual BDSM, there's a lot more boundaries and agreements from the beginning. And with non-monogamy, there's set up in a healthy way, much more overt agreements and expectations that are talked about beforehand. Whereas people just think someone's cute and start hanging out with them and have sex, and all of a sudden know all the things that they're supposed to be doing, quotation.
Right. And so much of those things tend to be based on the title. Like, now that we're in a relationship, now that we're Facebook official, now I have these expectations. I know I went through that after marriage, as much as we had talked about deconstructing marriage and having it be, a reflection of our relationship, not, the norm, whatever that is. Still there were expectations on me as a wife, on my ex as a husband. And I think you're right that there are communities who are kind of getting this right and front loading, like, okay, let's talk about these things. Even some dating sites, when you talk about the paying, some of the sites will literally ask, what happens when you get a check? Who pays? You can kind of front load these conversations. But then there has to be the check-in built in. We change. These things aren't going to be, if we make the assumption that the initial expectations are still going to stand 5 years down the road, maybe not. Maybe there needs to be room for fluidity and checking in on these agreements.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is like checking relationship check-ins. I guess this ties into this idea, or when we're thinking about us being responsible for our own feelings, our own emotions, is when someone breaks or doesn't fulfill an expectation, where's that line between us taking accountability for management of our own emotions and sincerely talking about how someone affected us, how someone's actions affected us?
Right. Yeah. And it's bringing it back home. It's looking internally and going, especially when we get triggered. That's when I think about it. When strong emotions come up, we notice anger, resentment, frustration. It's an opportunity to self-reflect a little bit and say, was there an expectation I had that wasn't met? Is that something I need to resolve internally? Is that an unrealistic expectation? Or is this something I do want to communicate to my partner? And then it sounds so basic, but I find myself talking about I statements. Own that. I had this expectation.
Yeah.
Not, you did this to me. You did this, you did that. And sometimes people take the little tips from the therapy and they go, you did this, so I feel this way. I'm like, wait, there's still a you statement in there.
That's a thought.
Right. Yeah. So
differentiate between feeling and thought.
Right. So that's why I say take it home. I mean, taking ownership over our own emotions and our own experience.
Yeah. And so I think you clearly were talking about what you do with clients that are already in session, but they're already in a relationship. They've already had these assumptions, and going forward, what is this? I'm thinking about what a relationship, or someone, if there's like a takeaway, like what's the relationship?
Like, what makes it work? What's working with expectations?
And I mean, it's the idea, I think there's sometimes this fantastical, or this idea of relationship anarchy. Well, there's absolutely no expectations, but even within that dynamic, there are certain ideas of how to be respectful or how to communicate.
Yeah.
So there's still these agreements. So I don't think we've come up with it. I just want a different word than expectation.
Yeah.
I think about as parenting, I think of expectation of like at a job, we have expectations of somebody, or we have expectations that are set out for us. I just want to get rid of expectations altogether and have a different word and have a different word.
Have a different word and start that conversation early. I feel like that's what works is when these things are not brought up because harm has been done, but when they're brought up at the beginning of starting a relationship. Again, whether that's, you mentioned it earlier, even friendships. I've just connected with somebody, on an online platform, and kind of had a lengthy first 2 responses as we were getting to know each other's dynamics. And then I didn't hear from them for 4 days and just peeked and got a message. And they were so apologetic, like, hey, sorry, it's been, so long, but then really named like, this is kind of how I am as a friend. I go dark a couple days, then I'll respond and pick up right where we left off. Yeah. And I mean, first and foremost, that works for me because that's how I communicate as well. But again, it was a conversation right from the jump, which is so helpful because now I can manage my own assumptions about what should happen and what shouldn't happen. So I think that's part of what works is not only to have conversations throughout the relationship, but right as you're starting to build one, know how you operate as much as you can, and then communicate that so that somebody can decide whether or not you're a right fit to be in a relationship with, whether it's a friendship or otherwise.
Yeah. And I think of resources, or I think about when having these discussions for the people that are listening and they're like, okay, well, what's the takeaway, or how do I figure out how to do this? I really recommend folks that are monogamous to take a look at some of the non-monogamy agreements and can use some of that as a loose template. Obviously, some of those things aren't going to apply if you're monogamous, but just getting the conversation going around what do expectations look, how do we time manage? How do we share time? I mean, that's another thing comes up. Huge piece of expectation outside of, I don't even want to get dragged down into the whole sharing household responsibilities things for them to live together. I just don't even want to go there. It's so monotonous. But I think that things like time management or expectations around time together, time apart, time with friends. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but that kind of discussion of how we manage that comes up really well in non-monogamy, because when you have potentially more than one romantic partner or more than one person you're spending romantic or sexual time with, the management, the discussion of time becomes, or schedules, is even more so than just if you're just dating one person or just in a relationship with one person.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a great starting point, in addition to those kind of non-monogamy agreements and foundations, just thinking about what expectations do we have for ourselves? Like really as a reflection question, what expectation do I have of myself? What expectation do I have in myself as a partner or as a friend? And then do I have those same expectations for other people? I laugh because maybe not, but I think that's really valuable to know is what are we measuring people up against, which I think is often our own inner critic. But then that's a good starting point. Like I said, there might be differentiation. Like for myself, I am a really ridiculously tidy we're getting into the household stuff, but I'm a ridiculously tidy person. And I do not have the same expectation that people that I live with are exactly as tidy as I am. I do have my limitations, which I try and communicate to people again, like, okay, I don't want, dishes growing mold, but I think that can be a good starting point, is just looking again internally and what are the expectations I hold myself to? And then am I assuming that everyone else must do the same?
Yeah. Well, and then don't those expectations come from things that you want or desires? I sometimes get into my head. I mean, I've been doing this work for 16 years and I'm like, what is even a relationship? What is a relationship even? Like, what's the point of a relationship? I know, going very dramatic here, but and so when you stop and slow down and reflect on what you're saying, Melissa, is what are my expectations of myself? What am I looking for? What am I wanting? What do I want? Really, it's what do I want my life to look like day to day?
Yeah. It's a much more dynamic way to look at it than what's my list of things that people have to hit for me to be in relationship.
You like check all my boxes.
Right. No, what is, oh yeah. 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 What is the life you want to be living?
Yeah. What do you
And
want
how
it to
can
look like?
how can you support your partner in that? How can your partner support you in that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a really good friend. It's really beautiful, actually. I mean, we'll say, NRE right now, total NRE, but she had for years and years and years would like partner with these people and be like, oh, this is working well for now, but had never really understood how much her passion for certain adventure things that not everyone does, mountain climbing and scaling, doing all these things that not the average person does. And at first she was like, oh, I think that my partner doesn't have to do these things. But then as she noticed more and more that relationships weren't working out because she was spending so much time doing these things that she loved, and her partners were sad not to be around her or had expectations that she would be home more with them. And the relationship didn't work out because she's like, well, I have these things. And so now when she figured this out, she really, she started someone who was very cynical of therapy, finally at like 40, tried a therapist out, that she recognized, like, I really want to have a companion to do adventures with. So now she's dating this person that is a volcano researcher. How perfect is that?
It's amazing.
But she didn't even understand. So her partners actually had these unspoken expectations. Oh, you know what I need to think of in this self-reflection? I think another piece to take away is think about how much of your expectations are based on previous relationships
Mm-hmm.
and thinking this is the way it's supposed to be. My former partner did this, or this is how we did things.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just check those things because maybe there is not a supposed to be. We've talked about that with queer relationships before. Let's just be fluid and differentiate based on the relationship we're in and what we want.
Yeah. Create your own, the dynamics, the possibilities are endless. There are so many ways that humans can exist together in relationships. So let's create. So I think that the takeaway, what we're both saying is, for listeners who are utilizing this to try new things or think of new ways to interact or bring it up to one of your partners, is to really reflect on yourself and look at what it is that you want, expectations that you have of yourself. So reflection of self, noticing patterns that you may be assuming certain expectations based on previous relationships. And then really, if you're in a new relationship, try talking about agreements with this new partner. If you are in a long-term relationship or long-term relationships right now, revisit or see it. Ask your partner, what are our agreements, or what things do we agree on? Talk to them, see what they say, and write in your experiences. Let us know, like, tell us if this works. Hopefully it doesn't cause arguments, but you can also let us know that what the hell, I brought this stuff to my partner and they're really pissed off right now. Or more likely tying with queer joy, tell us how the stories of how they got conversations sparked.
Absolutely.
How that happened. So, speaking of queer joy, Melisa, what was your queer joy of the week?
Yay. This is actually, I'm glad we talked about expectations because it's kind of in line. And I won't deviate too far from the queer joy, but just to expand on my relationship with my girlfriend in California, talk about somebody who just expectation free, especially on me going through a divorce and a move and having someone who loves me be like, okay, that's cool. No big deal. So amazing. And she and I don't get to, talk very often for lots of different reasons. So, and there was no.
Can I say real quick?
Yeah.
For straight listeners, we're talking about, this is Melissa's romantic partner, one of her romantic partners. Because straight culture, women call girlfriends, all the things.
Gosh, I forget that.
I know. I
No,
always
like,
tell my mom,
girlfriend,
"Mom."
I am in love with her. She has been in my life for over a year and wonderful. Our agreements are really awesome, I think. And we don't get to see each other very often. It had been about 2 months since I got to even FaceTime with her. And we had a date and she treated me to like dinner and she had everything, they sent to my house and we did a movie like watch party and it was so much fun. It was amazing. So that was my queer joy of the week.
Oh, that's awesome. My queer joy of the week was getting to hang out with my 13-year-old queer child and talk about queer things. And oh my gosh, I mean, for those of you who don't have kids, let me tell you, I learned so much from her and listening. I learned, I don't even know. I mean, I'm not going to, I could go on for days about all the things she tells me about, but learning about what the freedom of expression and the verbiage that queer youth, I mean, it's amazing. And it fills my heart every single day when she talks about these things. It's just, and, not to get too mushy and go down too much of a, showing my age, like, oh, when I was in high school, but really part of why I wanted to do a podcast like this and talking about queer joy and documenting is this role modeling, because I get to firsthand see young people and how different it is. And
Absolutely.
revel in that joy that they still have challenging things, but not anywhere near the things that I experienced in high school. And the things that I experienced were not even compared to so many other youth. So that's my queer joy, is getting to talk all the queer things with my queer teenager.
I love it. The queer youth give me so much hope. So much hope.
That's so awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening today. Please don't hesitate to write in any questions you have, thoughts, if you have a topic you want to hear, or even a guest that you want to hear from. We are always loving these new guests that we're bringing in and get to hear either people by themselves talk about relationships. We love seeing the couples and listening to couples and share their stories and their joys. So write us in. You can and follow us on Instagram at Connective Therapy Collective, Facebook, at Twitter, all the things. Check out our website. Thanks, everyone.